The night I realized my husband had been poisoning me. I was standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding a glass of water that I knew was safe because I had poured it myself from a sealed bottle I had bought with cash from a gas station 3 towns away from our home. That detail will matter later. Everything in this story matters, and nothing is an accident, because I am Margaret Harrison, and for 31 years I have been a forensic auditor, and the one thing 31 years of forensic auditing teaches you is that there is no such thing as a coincidence. There are only patterns that have not yet been named. The pattern in my own home had been building for 8 months before I saw it, and when I finally saw it, standing in that kitchen at 2 in the morning with my safe water in my safe glass, the thing I felt was not fear. The thing I felt was the specific cold clarity of a professional who has just identified the fraud and is now calculating exactly how to prove it. My name is Margaret. My husband's name is Richard. And this is the account of the 112 nights between the night I found the evidence and the morning everything he built against me came apart in his hands. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing this community show up from every corner of this country and beyond. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story does not get told halfway. Stay with me from the very first word to the very last one. Now, let me take you back to where it started. My mother, Eleanor Voss Harrison, and she always used all 3 names, which told you everything you needed to know about her, died on a Thursday morning in March, of the kind of quiet that people describe as peaceful, when they mean that the person they loved most did not suffer at the end, and they need that not suffering to be the thing they hold on to. She died in the bedroom she had slept in for 43 years, in the house my father built before he died young, and that she had maintained alone for the 31 years since, with the specific competence of a woman who had never once required anyone to do for her something she could do for herself. She left the house to me. She left her jewelry to my daughter, Claire, who is 26, and has her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's way of going completely still when she is thinking about something important. And she left in a trust that she had established 11 years before her death, with the specific foresight of a woman who understood that money and love are not the same thing and should never be stored in the same place. An estate valued at approximately $19 million. The trust named me as sole administrator. It named my daughter as sole beneficiary upon my death or legal incapacitation, and it contained, in the specific language that my mother's attorney had drafted over the course of 3 separate meetings, a clause that I had read 17 times in the 3 years since the trust was established, and that I had always understood abstractly but had never understood viscerally until 8 months ago. The clause stated that in the event of my death or legal incapacitation, administration of the trust would pass to my spouse, pending formal appointment of a new administrator by the courts. My mother had discussed this clause with me when the trust was established. She had said, "I included it because the law requires it, not because I trust him." I had laughed. I had told her she was being dramatic. I had told her Richard was a good man. I had believed that completely. I was wrong. Richard Harrison is 59 years old. He is a real estate developer who has been reasonably successful in his career and who has, in the 37 years I have known him, and the 33 years I have been married to him, always had the specific relationship with money that some people have with oxygen. Not grateful for it exactly, more simply unable to imagine existing without it in sufficient quantity. He is charming in the way that people are charming when charm has always been their most reliable professional tool. He tells good stories at dinner parties. He remembers names. He has the handshake of a man who has been making first impressions count since before I met him at 22 years old in the lobby of an accounting firm where I was a junior auditor, and he was trying to get a meeting with my boss about a financing arrangement that I would later come to understand had a structural flaw that his charm had been covering for 6 months. I identified the flaw in the financing arrangement within 11 minutes of reviewing the documents. Richard found that attractive. I found his finding it attractive to be one of the most unusual things anyone had ever communicated to me, because most people in my professional life had found it threatening rather than appealing. We were engaged within a year. We were married in the spring. For most of the 33 years since, the marriage had been the kind of marriage that is built on genuine compatibility and sustained by genuine effort, and that produces, over decades, the specific kind of partnership that feels so solid it never occurs to you to question whether it is actually what it appears to be. Until it does. The first thing I noticed was the coffee. not the taste. Richard has made my coffee the same way for 20 years, and I would recognize the specific ratio of dark roast to cream to the single spoon of brown sugar in the same way I would recognize his handwriting. The first thing I noticed was the quality of the morning after the coffee. I have always been an early riser. 6 a.m. without an alarm since my 30s, but in the autumn of last year I began waking at 9, sometimes 9:30, with a headache that settled behind my left eye, and a fogginess in my thinking that I initially attributed to grief. My mother had been gone for 4 months. Grief does what it does to the body and the mind in ways that do not always follow a predictable schedule, and I had been telling myself for those 4 months that the occasional fogginess was simply the grief doing its work. I kept a journal. I have kept a journal since I was 14 years old, and the discipline of recording the day's events and observations has always been the thing that keeps my thinking organized when the work is complicated and the details are many. I began recording the morning fogginess in October. By November I had 14 entries. By December I had 27, and when I laid those 27 entries side by side and looked at the pattern, the way I would look at a financial record, not at what each entry said individually but at what the sequence of them said collectively, I noticed something that stopped my morning completely and sent the specific chill down the length of my spine that has always, in 31 years of professional practice, meant that I have found the discrepancy. The fogginess was worse on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Those were the mornings when Richard made my coffee. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, when I was up before him and made my own, there was no fogginess, no headache, no hour lost between waking and clarity. On the weekends when he made the coffee, Saturday mornings were fine. Sunday mornings were not. He made coffee on Saturdays too. But on Sundays he also made breakfast. And on Sundays, uniquely, he also brought the coffee to me in bed rather than leaving it on the counter for me to collect when I came downstairs. I sat with my December journal open in front of me, and I looked at that pattern for a very long time. Then I did what I always do when I find a discrepancy I cannot yet explain. I went back to the beginning. I started auditing my own life. The audit took 6 weeks. I have never conducted a more important audit in my professional career, and I have audited the books of companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I say that with the specific precision of someone who means it exactly as stated. I audited my medication history and found nothing unusual. I audited my sleep patterns using the data from the fitness tracker I had worn for 3 years and found the degradation in sleep quality had begun in September, which was 5 months after my mother's death and 2 months after Richard and I had our one significant argument about the trust, an argument in which he had suggested, with the careful reasonableness of a man who has prepared his position in advance, that given the complexity of the estate and the emotional difficulty of administering it so soon after loss, it might be worth considering whether a professional trust management firm might take over the day-to-day administration. I had said no. He had not pressed the point. But the fitness tracker data showed that my sleep quality began declining in the 2 weeks following that conversation, which was a detail that the data could not have known was significant, and that I would not have known to look for if I had not been conducting a systematic audit of every available record. I audited the grocery deliveries. We had switched to online groceries delivery 18 months prior, and found that Richard had been placing separate additional orders through a secondary account I had not known existed. Small orders. Items that could reasonably be explained as additions to the regular shop. A specific brand of protein supplement. A particular variety of herbal tea that he described as something his doctor had recommended for sleep. The protein supplement arrived in quantities that did not match the consumption that would be consistent with his regular gym schedule. The herbal tea was ordered in quantities that were approximately twice what one person would consume in a month, but that would be exactly right for 2. I kept these findings in a separate notebook, one that I stored not in my home office, where Richard had access to everything, but in the fireproof document safe in my car, which has a combination that Richard does not know, and that I had never thought to give him, because it had simply never come up. I was grateful for the specific habits of a forensic auditor, the instinct to keep records, the habit of redundant storage, the refusal to consolidate everything in one place. The private laboratory was my next step. I drove 40 minutes from our home to a city I do not frequently visit, where I was unlikely to encounter anyone who knew Richard or me. I brought 4 things: a sample of the herbal tea from his secondary order, a sample of the coffee residue I had collected from the coffee maker on a Sunday morning, using a sterile container I had purchased from a pharmacy in A third location, a sample from the protein supplement, and the specific, focused attention of someone who has been looking for a discrepancy and believes she has found it, but needs the evidence to be laboratory confirmed before she changes the direction of her entire life. The lab results came back in 72 hours. The herbal tea was exactly what it claimed to be. The protein supplement was exactly what it claimed to be. The coffee sample was not exactly what it appeared to be. In addition to the standard components of dark roast coffee, the sample contained a compound that the laboratory identified as a benzodiazepine derivative, specifically a modified version of a sedative typically used in clinical psychiatric settings. In low doses, delivered consistently over time, it causes drowsiness, memory disruption, and a progressive difficulty with sustained concentration. The specific compound in my coffee was designed to be undetectable by taste and to metabolize rapidly enough that standard blood tests taken more than 6 hours after ingestion would likely return normal results. It was, in the laboratory's precise terminology, sophisticated. I sat in the parking lot of the laboratory for 23 minutes before I drove home, not because I was in shock. I had suspected this. I had been building toward this confirmation for 6 weeks. I sat in that parking lot for 23 minutes because I was conducting the next stage of the audit in my head, the stage where I identified not just the discrepancy but the full scope of what the discrepancy revealed, and what it would cost to address it, and what the risks were of getting the response wrong. By the time I started the car, I had the outline of a plan. It was not a complete plan yet, but it had the shape of one. And in 31 years of forensic auditing, I have learned that the shape of a plan, held in the hands of someone who knows what they are doing, is more than sufficient to begin. I did not confront Richard. This is the part that people, when I have told this story to the small number of people I have trusted with it, find most difficult to understand. Why did I not confront him immediately? Why did I not call the police the day the laboratory results arrived? Why did I not pack a bag and leave that evening and let the legal process take its course? The answer is the same answer I give when a client asks me why I do not simply flag the discrepancy and report the fraud the moment I find the first evidence. Because the first evidence is almost never the complete picture. Because the person who acts on the first evidence before the full scope of the fraud is understood almost always triggers a response that allows the fraudster to cover the remaining evidence before it can be documented. Because the most expensive mistake in forensic work is moving too fast on incomplete information. I had found the evidence that Richard was drugging me. I did not yet know why, beyond the obvious connection to my mother's trust. I did not know who else was involved. I did not know what specific steps had already been taken, what documents had already been altered, what communications had already been sent, what preparation had already been made for the stage of this plan that came after me. I knew one thing. Richard believed the compound was working. He believed that I was experiencing the progressive cognitive decline it was designed to produce. He believed that the audit I had been conducting in the fireproof safe in my car was the work of a woman whose judgment was impaired, and whose conclusions therefore could not be trusted by anyone who relied on her professional assessment. He believed he was winning, and the most valuable thing a forensic auditor can have in the investigation of a sophisticated fraud is a target who believes they are winning. A confident fraudster is a careless fraudster. A careless fraudster leaves more evidence. I needed more evidence, so I continued to drink the coffee. Not the actual coffee. I had learned, in the 4 days between the laboratory results and the development of my substitution protocol, to pour the coffee down the sink during the brief window each morning when Richard was in the garage or the bathroom or checking his phone. I replaced it with coffee from the sealed thermos I had prepared the previous night. The coffee in my cup was always mine. Richard never knew. And every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday morning, for the 8 months that followed, I sat across from my husband at the breakfast table, looking exactly like a woman whose mind was slowly, progressively clouding over, asking him questions I already knew the answers to, forgetting things I had remembered perfectly, making small errors in routine tasks that a woman with a deteriorating cognitive function would plausibly make, and that I had calculated carefully, enough to ensure they were consistent with the specific profile the compound was designed to produce. I performed my own deterioration with the specific discipline of someone who understands that the performance must be convincing enough to sustain scrutiny but not so extreme as to trigger an emergency response before I was ready for one. It was the most demanding professional work of my life. And I am not being dramatic when I say that my 31 years of forensic training were the direct reason I survived it. The second discovery arrived 43 days into the substitution protocol, on a Thursday evening when Richard had gone to a planning board meeting for a development project he was involved in, and I had the house to myself for 3 hours. I had been using these evenings, carefully without leaving evidence of the search, to conduct a physical audit of our home with the same systematic approach I bring to the audit of a corporate office. I had found nothing of significance in the first 3 evenings. On the fourth, in the drawer of Richard's stand, I found a business card. The name on the card was Dr. Leonard Ferris, M.D., and the specialty listed below his name was geriatric psychiatry. The address was in a city 2 states away. On the back of the card, in Richard's handwriting, was a date that was 5 weeks in the future and the notation, "First consult. Confirm availability for formal evaluation." I stood in the bedroom holding that card for a long time. Then I photographed it, replaced it in the exact position I had found it, and went back downstairs. A formal psychiatric evaluation, conducted by a specialist 2 states away who had no prior relationship with me and no access to my actual medical history, ordered by my husband without my knowledge, timed to occur approximately 5 weeks from the current date. This was the next stage of the plan. The compound was designed to produce evidence of cognitive decline. The hidden camera, which I had not yet found but would find 11 days later, inside the thermostat panel on the bedroom wall, was designed to document that evidence on video over an extended period. The psychiatrist 2 states away was designed to review that documentation, conduct an evaluation of a woman whose judgment appeared compromised by the pattern of behavior the camera had recorded, and produce a formal clinical finding that would support a legal application for guardianship. Not incompetency, guardianship, which under my state's law would transfer administrative control of a ward's assets, including a ward's role as administrator of a family trust, to the appointed guardian. The appointed guardian, in the application that Richard had already drafted, and that I found in a password-protected folder, on his laptop that he did not know, I knew the password to because he had changed it from the password we had shared for 15 years but had used the same logic pattern for the new password that he had used for every password change in our marriage, naming it after the year we met combined with the street where he grew up, which I knew as well as I knew my own address. The appointed guardian was Richard. My husband of 33 years intended to be declared my guardian, to control my access to my own finances, to administer my mother's trust on behalf of my daughter, to make decisions about my medical care, to determine where I lived and who I saw and what I was permitted to do. He intended to erase me, not from the world, just from myself. And he had spent 8 months preparing the evidence he needed to do it. The third discovery was the one that broke something in me that I have been careful, in the months since, not to describe as my heart, because my heart was intact and functioning, and carrying me through everything that came after. What broke was the specific, bounded thing that I had been protecting without knowing I was protecting it. The belief, held somewhere beneath the audit and the substitution protocol and the photographic record I was building, that there was some explanation for Richard's behavior that did not require me to accept that the person I had loved for 33 years had decided, as a calculated and deliberate choice, that my destruction was an acceptable price for what he wanted. I found the emails on a Wednesday afternoon. They were between Richard and a woman whose name I recognized immediately when I saw it in the sender field. Her name was Patricia Wren. I had known Patricia Wren for 22 years. She was my closest friend. She had been at my wedding. She had been at my mother's funeral. She had held my hand in the parking lot of the hospital on the night my mother was moved to palliative care, and had as the specific things you say to a person in that moment that only means something when the person saying them actually loves you. I believed, for 22 years, that Patricia Wren loved me. The emails covered a period of 11 months. The earliest one, sent 6 weeks before my mother's death, was a reply to a message from Richard that I could not see, but whose content was evident from Patricia's response, which began, "I've been thinking about this for a while too. She deserves better than what she's gotten from that trust. Eleanor was always more concerned with control than with fairness. If we can get ahead of this before the paperwork is fully processed, I think we have a real opening. She deserves better." That sentence in an email about the mechanism by which my best friend of 22 years intended to help my husband strip me of the administration of my mother's estate was the sentence I returned to more than any other in the weeks that followed. Not because it was the worst thing in the emails. It was not close to the worst thing in the emails. But because it was the most precise illustration of the specific quality of a betrayal that is not conducted in anger or in cruelty but in the comfortable language of justification. She deserves better. They had decided what I deserved, and they had decided it together, across 11 months of emails in which Patricia had contributed the specific knowledge of my interior life. My fears about my mother's health, my anxieties about the trust, my moments of genuine grief-related cognitive difficulty that I had shared with her in confidence as my closest friend, that Richard needed to make his plan credible. She had been his source. Every vulnerable thing I had told her for the previous year had been forwarded in the specific language of someone who has recast their betrayal as concern, to the man who was using it against me. I printed the emails. I drove to my car. I put the printed emails in the fireproof safe alongside the laboratory results and the photographs and the journal entries and the forensic record of 11 months of Richard's financial activity that I had been building for 6 weeks. Then I sat in the driver's seat and allowed myself exactly 15 minutes to feel the full weight of what I had just found. Not more than 15 minutes. I set the timer on my phone. When the timer went off, I drove to the office of a woman named Catherine Oakes, who had been the most respected forensic attorney in our state for 20 years, and who I had referred clients to on 4 separate occasions, and who I had called from the parking lot of the private laboratory on the day the coffee results came back, because I had understood even then that the evidence I was building was going to require the best legal mind available when the moment came to use it. Catherine was expecting me. I told her I had found the third piece. She said she had been waiting for the third piece. She said, "Now we build the response." Catherine Oakes has a conference room with a whiteboard that covers the entire length of one wall, and she uses it the way I use a spreadsheet, not to display information but to find the connections between pieces of information that are not visible when the pieces are held separately. We spent 4 hours in that conference room. On the Wednesday evening, I brought her the emails, with the printed emails and the laboratory results, and the photographs and the journal entries spread across the conference table and the connections between them building on the whiteboard in Catherine's handwriting until what had begun as a collection of separate findings had become a complete and coherent account of a specific legal fraud with a specific timeline and a specific set of participants and a specific body of evidence sufficient to support not just a civil response but a criminal referral. Catherine told me that what Richard and Patricia had constructed together, the drugging, the documentation, the hidden camera, the out-of-state psychiatrist, the guardianship application already drafted, constituted, in combination, criminal conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, criminal administration of a controlled substance without consent, criminal fraud, and civil conspiracy in the tortious interference with a trust administration. She told me the evidence I had assembled in 6 weeks of systematic auditing was more comprehensive than the evidence she had seen in cases that had been investigated by professional law enforcement teams over months. She said it with the specific tone of a professional complimenting another professional's work, rather than a person trying to make another person feel better, and I received it in the same spirit in which it was given. Then she asked me the question that determined the shape of everything that followed. She said, "Do you want to stop this, or do you want to finish it?" I understood the distinction she was drawing. Stopping it meant moving now, notifying the police, freezing the guardianship application, removing the camera, confronting Richard and Patricia before the plan could advance further. Finishing it meant waiting for the plan to advance to its most committed point, before revealing that I had been 3 steps ahead of it the entire time. Stopping it would end the immediate danger, but would give both Richard and Patricia the opportunity to claim that the plan was still in its preliminary stages and had not yet produced actionable harm. Finishing it would require additional weeks of the substitution protocol and the performance, but would produce a body of evidence so complete that neither of them would have a credible defense. I told Catherine I wanted to finish it. She nodded once, the way she nods when she has already anticipated the answer. She said, "Then we need to talk about the appointment with Dr. Ferris." The appointment with Dr. Ferris was scheduled for a Tuesday, 5 weeks from the date I had found the business card. Richard had told me about it on a Saturday morning, presenting it as something he had arranged out of concern for me, framing the specialist not as a psychiatrist but as a memory consultant who worked with people experiencing grief-related cognitive difficulties. He had described the specialist in the specific language of a man who has been told by a woman he trusts, and Patricia had always been the person Richard trusted with the human dimensions of his planning, that the framing must be compassionate rather than clinical. "You have been struggling since your mother passed," he had said, handing me the appointment card across the breakfast table, with the practiced tenderness that I had spent months cataloging and photographing, and recording in the journal in the fireproof safe. "I just want to make sure we are getting you the support you need." I had looked at the appointment card. I had said thank you. I had folded the card and placed it in my pocket and carried it with me to Catherine's office the following morning. Catherine had made a phone call. Dr. Ferris, it emerged, had lost his medical license in another state 3 years prior for insurance fraud connected to a series of false psychiatric evaluations he had produced in guardianship proceedings. He had subsequently obtained a new license in a state with less rigorous reciprocity review. He had been involved in 7 guardianship proceedings in the previous 4 years. In 5 of those proceedings, the ward whose evaluation he had conducted had lost administrative control of significant financial assets within 12 months of his evaluation. Catherine shared these findings with a colleague at the State Attorney General's office, who had been building a case against Dr. Ferris for 2 years, and who described the information Catherine provided as the specific piece of evidence she had been missing. There would be people at the appointment when I arrived, not visible to Richard or Dr. Ferris or Patricia, who had arranged to coincidentally be in the city that Tuesday and had texted me the previous week suggesting we have lunch after my appointment. Lunch I had agreed to attend with the same performed warmth I had been delivering for 8 months. There would be people at the appointment, and what happened at that appointment would determine whether Richard and Patricia spent the next decade as free people or not. The Tuesday morning arrived with the specific quality of an ordinary morning that is about to become the most significant morning of a very long story. I dressed carefully, not dramatically. I was not performing triumph. I was not arriving in the colors of someone who has decided to make a statement. I wore the gray blazer I wear when I am giving testimony in formal proceedings, which I have done 11 times in 31 years. I wore my mother's pearl earrings, which I had not worn since her funeral, and which I chose that morning with the full understanding of what choosing them meant. I drove to the appointment with Catherine in the passenger seat of my car, going through the final sequence of the plan with the efficiency of 2 professionals who have rehearsed it until it is a refix rather than a decision. We had been planning this specific Tuesday for 5 weeks. Every contingency had been addressed. Every variable had been mapped. Every possible response from Richard or Dr. Ferris or Patricia had been anticipated and the counter-response prepared. I was not afraid. I want to be precise about that. I was not afraid because I was not walking into an unknown situation. I was walking into a situation I had built. I was the architect of this Tuesday morning, not its subject. That distinction made all the difference. Richard was in the waiting room when I arrived. He stood when I walked in and crossed to me with the concerned husband expression that I had watched him practice, without knowing I was watching, in the bathroom mirror on more than one occasion in the previous months. He took my hand. He told me I looked tired. He asked if I had managed to sleep. I told him I had slept beautifully, which was true, because I had in fact slept beautifully for 8 months, thanks to the substitution protocol and the cold, focused clarity that accompanies the knowledge that you are in complete possession of the facts. He looked slightly uncertain at the word beautifully. It did not match the profile he had been curating, but recovered quickly with the practiced flexibility of a man who has been in real estate negotiations for 3 decades. Dr. Ferris's assistant called my name. Richard moved to accompany me. I told him I would prefer to go in alone, and the look that crossed his face in the fraction of a second before he reassembled the concerned expression contained everything I needed to confirm that the plan required my presence in that room with Dr. Ferris without a witness to what was said. I went in alone. I sat down across from Dr. Ferris, and then I placed Catherine's card on the desk between us and told him, in the specific tone of a forensic auditor who has completed her audit, that before we began, I wanted to make sure he had his attorney's contact information available, because there were people outside who needed to speak with him, and he was going to want representation present for that conversation. Dr. Ferris looked at the card. He looked at me. The evaluation he had been prepared to conduct was not the evaluation he had anticipated. The woman sitting across from him was not the woman he had been briefed to expect. I watched the specific recalibration happen in real time behind his eyes. The moment a person who believed they were conducting a transaction understands that the transaction has already been completed and not in their favor. What happened next took 4 hours, 2 state attorneys, one federal agent from the Financial Crimes Division who had been building a separate case against a shell company Richard had established 18 months prior, and the specific, devastating efficiency of a plan that has been built by a forensic auditor over 8 months of systematic evidence collection. Richard was in the waiting room when the agents entered. Patricia was at a restaurant 2 blocks away, waiting for a lunch that I was not going to attend, when her phone and her financial accounts were simultaneously frozen pursuant to a court order that Catherine had prepared 6 weeks earlier and held in readiness for this specific Tuesday morning. Richard did not shout, he did not cry, he did not make a scene. He sat in that waiting room and went through the stages of a man who has been in the business of calculating odds his entire life and is now calculating them in a situation where every number is against him, and is arriving, progressively and visibly, at the conclusion that the numbers are simply not there. The attorney they called for him arrived within 45 minutes. He spent 11 minutes reviewing the evidence package Catherine provided. Then he asked for 15 minutes alone with Richard. When he came out of that private conversation, he said 4 words to Catherine. What does she want? Catherine said, everything she is owed. Not $1 more, not $1 less. I want to tell you about the phone call I made that evening. Not to Catherine, though I called Catherine. Not to my daughter Claire, though I called Claire and spent 40 minutes on the phone with her, and cried for the first time in 8 months during that call in the specific way that you cry when the thing you have been holding together for a very long time is finally allowed to come apart, because it is safe to let it. The phone call I want to tell you about was the one I made before those calls. Sitting in my car in the parking lot of the building where Richard had intended to have me declared incompetent, with my mother's pearl earrings still in my ears, and the late afternoon light coming through the windshield in the specific amber quality of a day that is running out. I called my mother's number. I know she was not there to answer it, I know that. But the voicemail greeting is still her voice. And I had not called it since the week after she died, and I needed, in that specific moment, to hear her say her name in the way she always said it. All 3 of them. The way that told you everything about who she was before you heard another word. She answered on the 3rd ring, the way she always had. Eleanor Voss Harrison. I said, Mom, it's done, I'm okay. You were about the clause, I'm sorry, I laughed. And then I sat in the parking lot until the amber light went blue, and the street lights came on. And then I drove home to the house that was mine, and had always been mine, and that I had never, in 8 months of the most sustained performance of my professional life, once believed I was going to lose. There are 3 things I want to tell you before I close this account, because I have thought carefully about what is worth carrying forward from a story like this and what should remain simply as evidence of what happened and nothing more. The first thing, Richard's guardianship application was formally withdrawn and the criminal charges against him, criminal administration of a controlled substance, criminal fraud and conspiracy, were filed 7 weeks after the Tuesday appointment. He has entered into a plea negotiation. The outcome will be what it will be. I do not find that I spend significant time thinking about the outcome, which is not indifference but something closer to the specific professional detachment of a forensic auditor who has submitted her findings and understands that what happens to the findings next belongs to a different process. The second thing, Patricia Wren was charged as a co-conspirator. The 22 years of friendship that preceded the 11 months of emails, the real parts of it, the parts that were genuine, the parts that I carry with me in the specific way you carry the things that were true before they were complicated. Those years exist in a category that I have not yet found the right language for, and I am not sure I will. The most honest thing I can say about Patricia is the same thing I said about Richard, which is that I do not find I spend significant time thinking about it, and I am learning to understand that not spending significant time thinking about it is not a wound that has closed too fast but a professional habit of mine that has found one of its best applications. The third thing, and the most important thing, my mother's trust remains intact. My daughter Claire will receive everything Eleanor Voss Harrison spent 40 years building. The children's foundation that my mother endowed in the final year of her life, the one that Richard had never asked about because it was not yet visible in the financial records he was reviewing, will continue to be funded for the next 30 years pursuant to the terms my mother established. I think about my mother every day. I think about the 11 years she spent building a legal structure designed to outlast her and protect what she cared about most from the kind of threat she had been wise enough to anticipate, and that I, for a long time, had been too trusting to recognize. I wear her pearl earrings on Tuesdays now, every Tuesday. Not as a ritual of victory, I am not interested in rituals of victory, as a reminder that the most important audit you will ever conduct is the one you conduct on the people who have access to everything that matters to you. That love and trust are not the same thing. That love is what you feel, trust is what you verify. My mother knew the difference. She built her love into a vault and gave me the combination and trusted me to know when to use it. I used it. And the tea in my cup this morning is just tea. It is just, and the morning is clear, and the work continues, and I am Margaret Harrison. And this is the account that I promised myself I would tell completely and honestly, and without omission, when it was finally safe to tell it. It is safe now, it is over, and I am for the first time in 33 years, exactly and entirely and irrevocably myself. I want to ask you something before this ends, and I am asking it sincerely, because the conversations that happen in the comments of these stories are consistently the most honest conversations I encounter anywhere. Margaret said that the most expensive mistake in forensic work is moving too fast on incomplete information. And she applied that principle not to a corporate fraud but to her own marriage, to the most personal audit of her life, with the same discipline she would bring to any professional engagement. I want to know if you have ever had to do that, to hold the evidence of something painful and stay with it. Not rushing toward confrontation, not moving until you were ready, because you understood that moving too soon would cost you more than waiting. Have you ever had to be that disciplined about something that was also breaking your heart? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me this. What do you think Margaret's mother knew that Margaret had not yet understood when the trust was established? Because I think that is the most interesting question this entire story asks, and I want your honest answer. If this story is one that belonged to someone in your life today, if you know a woman who is currently in the fog of something she has not yet been able to name, who is second-guessing herself in ways that feel new and wrong, who is being slowly and carefully convinced that her own perception of her life cannot be trusted, share this with her. The most important thing Margaret did was not the substitution protocol, or the evidence collection, or the Tuesday appointment. The most important thing Margaret did was keep the journal. She wrote down what she noticed when she noticed it, before the fog had time to convince her she had not noticed it at all. Tell the woman in your life to keep the journal. Tell her that the audit starts with the first discrepancy. Tell her to trust the pattern before she can name it, and tell her that her mother's pearl earrings are waiting for her to be ready to wear them. Subscribe if you have not already, turn on notifications, and come back for the next one. Because the story we are telling next week begins with a woman who received a phone call on the morning of her retirement party that changed the direction of the next chapter of her life in ways that nobody in the building